station's website, intellectualradio.com, and you can hear the broadcast live. And then also, I have a Facebook live feed going on my personal page, Annette, known as Annette. And then also, we are on YouTube on our page, Mind, Body, and Soul. Get Caught in the Net. So you can type in MBSWANET on YouTube, Get Caught in the Net, and you will see us live there as well. So as you come in also to the live feed, would you please do me a huge favor and go ahead and like and share, so we can get today's session out and get you all a chance to interact with us on this afternoon. I am kind of still. I don't want to say reeling, but I'm still kind of in the light of last night's radio broadcast and what we did on the other show. We talked about Black owned businesses and whether we should support or not. So today's topic may help us to slide a little bit into that on today. I did not plan it that way, but all things work together. I am joined in the studio this afternoon. To my immediate right, I am joined by a nice young man that I just met probably about a month ago, as a matter of fact, and we were able to talk and talk about. Who he is and what he does. And then I mentioned my radio show. So this is how we came to interact, and I invited him onto the show, and here he is on today. I'm introducing to many and maybe presenting to others Ted Williams III. How are you on this afternoon?
I am fantastic. Thank you so much for having me, Diane.
Good,
It's
good.
good
I'm
to
so
be here.
glad you're here. I
Absolutely.
want you to make that mic your friend because
All
I
right.
want them to be able to hear you on today.
Absolutely. I really have a problem having people hear me, so I will, but I will make sure I'm close to the microphone.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. And then, of course, to my far right is you all know who we have here, Apostle Dion Hunt. He is actually my co-host on the other show, but I asked him to join me. Sometimes he comes in and joins us on Mind, Body, and Soul.
Sometimes.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
So he's here on this afternoon, and gentlemen, it looks like we kind of color coordinated today, all of us
Oh,
actually.
absolutely.
Um,
Great minds think alike.
there you go.
Absolutely.
No phone calls were made. We just did this thing.
Right.
So I'm so glad to have both of you here on today. Apostle Hunt is going to help facilitate today's discussion as well. Let's see here. Let's do this. I want to further formally introduce you to Williams. I wanted to read a little bit of his bio that he submitted. And I will say this before I even read this. I have an assistant that created a promo for
Mm,
today's show. And when I immediately sent her your information, she
mm.
said, "Oh my gosh, I know him." I said, "You do?" And
Wow.
she remembers the PBS
Yes.
shows.
Yes. Absolutely.
She said, and
Yeah.
if I'm not mistaken, that's his face. I
Yeah.
know him.
Yeah.
And she remembers listening to you. And I was like, okay,
Mm.
wow, who do I have coming on here today? No, but seriously, that was actually, good to hear
Yeah. Absolutely.
someone to recognize you. You have here, Ted Williams III has taught political science at Wright College, Chicago State University, and currently is the chairman of the social science department at Kennedy King College. He holds degrees in public policy studies from the University of Chicago and Rutgers University, and is the former host of WYCC PBS Television's weekly talk show. He has provided political commentary for BET, WGN TV, and NBC TV, Upfront with Jesse Jackson, PRI Smiley and West, WVON Radio, and a host of periodicals. He is an accomplished speaker and actor who
Wow.
has appeared in commercials and training videos for companies including McDonald's, Empire Carpet, Six Flags, Federal Express, Kraft, and Accenture. Additionally, he is the author of the production Torn the Musical. Oh, wow. Now, I didn't know that.
Mhm.
And of the book The Way Out, which we're going to be discussing on today, Christianity, Politics, and the Future of the African American Community. He is also a recent contributor to the Third World Press text, Not Our President.
Mhm.
Williams is a former candidate for the Chicago City Council and holds a number of national and local board positions. He considers his most important work his role as a mentor to young people
Mm.
and as a husband and father to Rosalind and their three beautiful children, Gabrielle Amaris, is it?
Absolutely, you got it right.
All right, and Ted the
Impressive.
fourth.
And everyone gets that name right.
Is that right?
That's impressive. Yes.
I have a phobia about
Oh
mispronouncing
no, you
people's
got it
names.
right. You got it right. And trust me, she's 10. She'll tell you if you get it incorrect.
Is that right?
Yeah, and actually, every one of those names has a biblical meaning. So Gabrielle means God's messenger, Amaris means God's promise, and Theodore means God's gift.
Is
So
that
it's yeah, so
right?
it's important to get them all right.
Okay, well,
Wow.
great, great. That's good stuff right
Hmm.
there. I love it. I love it. Yeah, I want to make sure I pronounce that
Thank you.
right. So, okay, great. Well, yeah, we are grateful that you again have joined us on this afternoon. And um, let me do this real quick. If my producer can take me to a very quick break, I want to clear up some things, and we can come right back to make sure everybody is in. Okay, you listen to My Body and Soul with Annette right here on Intellectual Radio.
Hey, is that camera that feed right there from your iPhone or from there?
That's the Facebook Live, and then that's the YouTube.
That's the YouTube and that's that camera.
Oh, where's the YouTube? I'm sorry, right in front of us.
The creator of all things, there is no other God beside thee, and we stand here and reverence your name. For you are worthy to be lifted up. Please receive our sincere worship. For you are the mighty God we serve. All the earth proclaim. The mighty God we serve. We serve a mighty God, mighty God. Let the angels bow down. Let heaven and earth adore him, yeah. God we serve. What a mighty God we serve. The creator of all things, there is no other God beside thee, and we stand here in reverence to your name. For you are worthy to be lifted up. Please receive our sincere worship. For you are the mighty God we serve. All the earth proclaim. The mighty God we serve. We serve a mighty God. Mighty God. Oh, let angels bow before. Let heaven and earth adore. We serve a mighty God. God we serve. We serve a mighty God. God we serve. He is holy, magnificent God. There's no one beside thee. Let us see his majesty. Holy, magnificent God. You're worthy. Yes, you are. Let us declare that he is holy, magnificent. No one beside thee. Let us declare that he is holy, magnificent. There is no Help me worship him. He's worthy. Yes, he is. Say he's mighty, 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 mighty. Mighty God. We worship the King. We honor the King. 'Cause you are the mighty, mighty God. We adore thee. Adore thee. We adore thee. Yes, we do. We adore thee. Adore thee. Adore thee. Yeah. Say he's mighty, 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 mighty. He is powerful. He is strong. And we give him all the praise. He's my God.
All right, welcome back. Welcome back. What a mighty God we serve. That was none other than Zoriantu Brown and the Willing Souls. Thank you so much for joining us on this afternoon. Coming back, because we did a quick little break, had a little technical difficulties there, and we were just trying to get it all straightened out. And again, we've done a new live feed on Annette Known as Annette, my personal page. If you guys have not done so already, please do me a favor and go to the YouTube channel, MBSWANET. That should be uninterrupted for you. And you can go ahead and subscribe there and click the bell so that you will know when we come on live. So let's go back into this. I had already introduced my guest and had already read his bio. And we want to try and go into today's topic. Now, I see that you have with you the book that we wanted to
I do.
discuss. Oh, you have a couple of books there.
I do.
Now-
I didn't know what the other one. So wonderful.
Okay, no problem.
It's fine.
We were trying to discuss, trying to figure out what we're going to talk about today.
Oh, yeah.
You kind of gave me a few choices there, and I went with the last one. So we wanted to try and discuss uplifting the. Help me, please.
Actually, the African American community.
Yes.
And so I can start if you
You
don't
may,
mind.
you
Absolutely.
may.
So thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here, particularly to be a part of a conversation not only that is sociological and community focused, but that is theological also. I've always been a firm believer that God is our source and our strength, and our greatest days were days in which the church led our social movement.
Yes.
We will not go forward in this country if we don't have faith at the core of what we're trying to do. So our story is very complicated in this nation. In 1619, which will be 400 years, the anniversary will be 400 years next year that we've been here in this country, 1619 to 1919, excuse me. Yeah, 1619 to 2019, 1919, 2019.
Okay.
Forget what year it is. Forget what century it was for a second. My bad.
Right.
But during that time, we have benefited in some ways from the American story, right? So African Americans are Americans and have in many ways, although we have struggled heavily, we also have benefited economically, socially, and otherwise. For instance, African Americans, if we were a separate country, we'd be the 8th wealthiest country in the entire world.
Wow.
So we are not sort of a poor people, but by American standards, we are very poor because for the past 400 years, we have been discriminated against through the legal system. We have been, I would argue, probably America's most hated minority. If you look at the crime statistics around hate crimes in this country, the vast majority of hate crimes, although anti-Semitism is real and anti-LGBTQ violence is real, there is no group that receives the same level of hate crimes. It's almost 3-to-1 that African Americans receive. And so we recognize that though we are America's stepchildren that they did not necessarily want, we still benefit in some ways from being in this country. And my argument is that we have got to look at the glass as half full rather than half empty. We've got to look at the wonderful economic situation, the great political progress that we've made. We're America's most politically powerful minority as well. With the exception, if you treat the Jewish Americans in one way, you could look at them. But if you look at Latinos, Asian Americans, no one has the representation African Americans have. No one has the political mobilization that African Americans have, and no one can move things in the way that we are able to move them. We've had an African American president. We have elected literally 3 out of the last 5 African American senators right from the same neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. So we're very politically and socially powerful. We have to wield that power well. 8th largest economy, the question becomes, what do we spend our money on? And so I've written extensively about how do we move forward? What do we have to do? And if you want to get into this now, I can. There's a 3-part plan to move us forward. I can wait, or I can tell you about it right now.
Okay. Well, what I would love for you to, but let me say this.
Sure.
If anyone has any comments, questions, you want to interact today with my guest here, Mr. Williams, I'm going to give out the call in number 708-223-8953. And I know we want to hear what he has to say, but I wanted to give you the number again, 708-223-8953. We want to hear from you guys on today. He may spark up something.
Hopefully.
I'm
Yeah.
quite sure that he is going to spark up
Yeah.
something. I was actually listening to the audio version of The Way Out,
Mhm.
and it's a lot. Oh God, it's a lot
Oh, my
impacted
God.
in there, and I'm trying to get through. So I know he's going to spark up something today. Apostle, did you want to say something real quick?
Well, yeah, I was also listening to the audio version, and so much information and a wealth of knowledge in that book, and it really kind of one of the things that it did for me, and it gave me the hunger and the appetite to kind of delve deeper
Yes.
and find out more. I mean, there was so much that he just kind of just nugget after nugget after nugget, and I was blessed just listening to the audio version.
Yes, definitely. Again, the name of this book is The Way Out,
Mhm.
the one I'm referring to, that listen to the audio version. And we're going to let you know where you can get it before the show ends on today. So I'm just going to show it real quick. All right, you guys. I'm
Wonderful.
sure your listeners probably already know, but yeah, this is it looks, it's not a huge book, but
But it's
there's a
loaded.
lot impacted in
It's
here.
loaded.
It's
Yes.
loaded. It's definitely loaded. Okay, now where do you want to start on today?
Well, once again, we have got to figure out how, as a people, we move forward in America. If you look at since 1865, 1863, 1865, our abolition from slavery, we still have economically struggled so heavily in this country. The government had promised that they would give us 40 acres and a mule, which many people oftentimes say, well, the government never gave it to us, but many people oftentimes say, well, we got welfare, we got these sorts of things.
Mhm.
If you look at what 40 acres and a mule was, it was not welfare. It was not a handout. 40 acres and a mule was economic empowerment. We would have had 40 acres of land and a mule to work that land. So really, African Americans have never been asking the government in America for anything.
Right.
We've only been asked for our fair share. And by the way, it wasn't us at the time that suggested the 40 acres and a mule. The federal government recognized that you could not release a people who had been enslaved for 250 years with no economic resources, no economic prosperity, and expect them to survive. Well, when the government allowed the southern states during post-Reconstruction to basically usurp that authority the government had, then we basically got into a situation that we were economically handicapped, and we're still suffering from that to this day. So in my mind, what we have is we have basically, once again, I like to look at the glass as half full, not just half empty. So I think there are three basic principles that we can look at in terms of how do we go forward as a people. Number one, as I said before, faith and family are critical to our struggle. We have always only had the only institution we've ever owned in this country is the church.
Hmm.
And so the civil rights movement came out of the church. The liberation struggle came out of the church. And yes, the same people who were basically arguing that we should be enslaved were people of faith. It was also people of faith who fought for our abolition. And so it's a complicated story. But as we were talking to the pastor here earlier, we were talking about how people forget that. They want to bash the church and bash Christianity. And I can understand why they would, because there were many people who used Christianity to enslave and oppress us.
Absolutely.
However, on the flip side, Christianity, the Quaker movement in this country, the abolition movement in this country, and more important, the Black liberation struggle in this country all came out of the church. So we have to have the church. And the church, I would argue, supports the second most institution in America, important institution in America, which is the family.
Yes.
70% of our children grow up without a father in the home. There is no community on this planet that has that same level of fatherlessness. So when you ask the question, how do we move forward? If we don't rebuild our families, we have nothing. Well, what institutions best to support our family? It is the church. What other institution is going to teach a Black man how to love a woman? What other institution is going to teach children to hold off on their sexuality until they're in a position where they have made a commitment together to not only themselves, but also the community? So we've got to have the church at the center of what it is that we do. Secondly, we have to have entrepreneurship. 70 cents on every dollar that is earned by local entrepreneurs is reinvested back into the community. So if you think about one of the reasons why we have a lot of wealth, but we don't have a lot of resources is because we spend our money with people who do not reinvest in our community. In the book, I write about Tulsa, Oklahoma, which we talked about, Black Wall Street, where the black dollar circulated 60, 70 times in that community. The federal government allowed for that community to be bombed in the Tulsa race riots. And so we recognize the federal government has never sort of worked towards our liberation in that way, our real economic liberation. We've gotten some political and social freedoms, but we haven't really ever gotten economic freedom. And Tulsa, Oklahoma was one sort of blip of hope on a spectrum of despair that we've got to figure out a way to get back to. Last but not least, I write and how education really is the passport to our future. We allow ourselves to be educated in a system that has always proven itself not to work for us. If you look at the state of Illinois, for instance, we are 48 out of 50 in terms of education inequality and 48 out of 50 in terms of education financing to the schools. So what we have is we have a situation in the public schools in Illinois where poor brown and black children are not being educated consistently. There's been nothing, no federal movement to really change that other than No Child Left Behind piece, but it hasn't given the resources. It left the money behind, and it hasn't given the resources that we need. And so my argument is that we have to reclaim our local schools. We have to either start schools. I think the charter school movement, as controversial as it is, gives Black people the opportunity to open their own schools and to teach principles that would work for our community and collective development. Those are opportunities I think are great. I personally am someone that is a supporter, advocate, and participant in Christian schooling. My children go to Christian school. My wife works for a Christian school. I went to Christian school. We give money to Christian schools because, as Dr. King said very clearly, the real purpose of education is both knowledge and character. And if we get the knowledge down and we don't get the character, we have just educated devils.
Woo. Yes, yes, yes. Oh my goodness. Okay.
So much.
I was writing down notes as you were talking. And in the first two things you were talking about, church and the family, I always say that. I mean, it's like we have to, that has to be, what we focus on, and that's the only way to move forward. I'm appreciative of how you brought in, how can you really reconstruct the family, or, without the church's help. And I think sometimes people kind of dismiss, the church. You can't separate that, to me, in my mind.
You can't. And one of the things that he brought out is the need for character building. And part of that, we're dealing with a generation now that's angry. And where does anger, where does hurt, where does the feeling of betrayal, all of that factor into where we are now mentally as a people and how we move forward from that? I think that the church and right teaching and right biblical principles that are instilled in our people will give us the tools that we need to handle this feeling of being disenfranchised, and this feeling of being left behind and targeted, and this feeling of having to deal with all these racial systems that have been against us, and not just feel like a victim, or not just feel like we have to come out swinging, but how do we handle all of this stuff? How do we process all of this stuff and effectively move forward, not just individually, but as a people? I believe that the gospel of Jesus Christ has to work hand in hand with that. It has to.
Yes, definitely.
Because a lot of what I'm seeing, just as a ministry gift, is that I'm seeing young people that are angry about racial tension and racial issues. And some of this stuff, a lot of this stuff is nothing new. It's just being more advertised and readily seen now because we're in the age of social media. But they're angry and they're asking a question: how is it that we receive a doctrine, even receive the gospel? There was something that I mentioned to Ted on before the show, is that I think it was D.L. Hughley that said the same person or the same people that gave us Christianity gave us the word nigger.
Hmm.
And so, how do we receive doctrine? How do we receive the gospel from someone? How do we separate even knowledge and information from the oppressor that's given it to us? How do we separate that? And if they're tainted, then the knowledge must be tainted. And so these are questions that we have to deal with, even as the church and as leaders, that we have to be able to answer their
Yeah.
questions and their concerns,
Mhm.
and not just dismiss them and say, "Oh, just follow Christianity because it's right." You
Absolutely.
see, we have to prepare ourselves for these type of questions because they they challenge us as leaders, but we have to study to show ourselves approved and be able to meet those issues head on.
Mhm. Well, it's pastors like you who recognize the need for the sociological and the community perspective
Yes,
that to me are at the forefront of how we regain young people. You know, young people really are much more interested in what we do than what we say.
absolutely.
And so they recognize a church that may be talking a lot of good stuff, but if that church is not in the community, getting their hands dirty, then ultimately they're not going to pay attention, which they should not. Why? Because that's what Jesus was doing. And I think I like in our story, because it is a complicated story, but I like in our story, and this is, your space of theology, to the story of Joseph
Hmm.
and how God used his enslavement and his oppression to ultimately not only benefit him, but benefit an entire nation, his family, entire nation. And I think African Americans have to look at our conditions in the same way. I was at an event a couple years ago with a woman from Zambia in Central Africa. And she said to me, she was working in a Christian charity. An African woman said to me, she said, "We look to you all to help us.
Wow.
We look at you in your privileged position." See, we don't use the word privilege with Black folks very often, but you've got to recognize once again in
My
America,
God.
we are privileged. We have resources, we have opportunities, and what we have to do is we've got to take a hold of those, and we've got to begin to channel our resources into spaces that help us. They look to us for leadership, they look to us for charity. Our community, even our culture, is being replicated all over the world.
Yes.
When you think about our music and our entertainment and our films and all those
Fashion.
various things, our fashion, I mean, African Americans are really dominating the world in that way. If you go to Asia right now, I've been in South Korea a couple times, they are doing hip hop dance.
Mm.
Right.
And they have figured it out. They actually do it better than people in America now.
Mm.
And that is the entire sort of culture of the Korean K-pop movement. Where does it come from? It comes from the streets of Chicago, comes from the streets of New York, comes from the streets of Detroit. And so we have to capitalize off of that. I'm telling you, it is not for me an issue of we are in despair. We have got to figure out how do we take advantage of what we already have. And once again, the church, if we have the right theology, we help people understand not only that this was a part of God's ultimate sovereign plan in our space and that we have opportunities now, but we also have to teach people that white people did not create Christianity.
Right.
White people did not start the spread of Christianity, that African Christianity predates European Christianity, and that the largest churches that are growing in the world right now are in African countries. European Christianity is dying out. Why? Because European numbers are dying out. Why? Because sociologically, they're having less children. They are embracing alternative lifestyles that don't produce children. They are living longer. These are things that are real sociologically. You don't have to understand this. The sociologists, I went to the University of Chicago. I have one of my professors who's a Christian who was teaching that 70% of European countries are under what's called replacement fertility levels, meaning that they are shrinking, not growing. And the two fastest countries for growth in America in the world are India and China. There are a billion people in China. There are just under a billion people in India. Those folks are growing. African countries are growing very heavily. Why? Because they're having many children still. If you look at generationally, you and I, we all know we're Americans. We've adopted American culture. So our parents, grandparents had 9, 10 kids.
Mhm.
Our we are having 3, 4 kids, 2 kids,
Less,
whatever, and those numbers are going down. Well, what happens is that shrinks the population, shrinks the economic base, and those are things that are happening in European countries that African people are not contributing to, particularly African people in the church are living counterculturally. And as a result, I think are in a very powerful position to make a difference in the world.
Ooh, this is good. Oh, good stuff. I hate to even pause you. I want you to just continue. Okay, I do want to ask a question though. Now, when you talked about the different ways of us to move forward, and you start talking about the church, the family, educational. I, how do you get beyond? Okay, how do we get there? How do you get beyond that mentality that obviously we're
Wow.
fighting against? To even say that we need ways to move forward. Do you know what I mean?
Sure. So, African Americans struggle from a significant amount of PTSD. There's no way that you could live in this country for 400 years and receive the consistent messages of self hatred and not have internalized them at some point. So, in many ways, African Americans are really only reflecting what America has given them, right? So, we are, I believe, more American than we are African. And what has America said to us is that we're nothing. America also historically has been a proponent and purveyor of violence across the world. So I tell people all the time, when you look at these kids in the hood shooting each other, there's nothing more American than to shoot somebody. America has the highest rate of gun violence in the world by far. We have 13,000 deaths by handgun every year, 19,000 deaths by suicide every year. We have more nuclear weapons in this country than all the other countries in the world combined. So when you see people living in poverty, shooting and killing each other, they are being as American as apple pie, because that is what Americans do. And so what I am suggesting is that we have to begin a new perspective about who we are. I love the conversations we're having about theology and also about history, so that we can recognize that we come from something greater than what we are in this country. But even if we don't get to Africa, we could talk about the greatness of Black people in America.
Absolutely.
And look at all the ways that they have overcome oppression and have basically, and there's a guy by the name of Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who wrote a report in the 1960s about the Black family. And what he argued, he was the Secretary of Labor for the United States government. And he argued that, number one, the Black family was the most important institution that we had to retain, number one. And so federal policies that destroy the Black family, which there were many, which we could talk about, were antithetical to our progress. But he also wrote that Black people had come amazingly far in one generation. And he also argued, this white male from the state of New York, who was also a senator, also argued that a lesser people would have been crushed even greater by the oppression that they experienced, and that African people had moved very quickly in a very short time with very little animosity towards other people. I mean, think about that if you think about what that says. And so we have come very far, very fast, and yet we still have internalized, once again, and embraced perceptions of ourselves that are so damaging. America does not love Black people. America likes to sleep with Black people, but doesn't want to marry Black people. So they'll take our culture,
talk about it,
right? Take our culture. They'll take all those things, but doesn't necessarily want that. So what does that mean? African Americans have once again internalized the same self-hatred. We are the only community on this earth that uses a racial epithet to describe ourselves. You don't have to even have somebody else call us the N-word. We got it ourselves. We'll call ourselves N's. We'll call ourselves Black. We'll call ourselves lazy. We'll call ourselves this. Well, to me, ladies and gentlemen, it's that old story of the elephant, that if you put a chain on an elephant and you have that chain on an elephant long enough, eventually that mighty elephant, you take that chain off, the elephant will not move because he will assume that he is still in chains. That's where we are.
Deep. Did you want to say something?
Well, how do you feel that we should move on from where we are? Because I feel like you've mentioned and you brought it up, that we have taken on so much of the American culture as African American people that we've lost who we are. And I was in Nigeria earlier this year, and one of the major things that was, we were in a small village in Nigeria, and we talked to an elder statesman, a gentleman who was basically the father of that community. and everyone honored him, everyone revered him. When he walked in, the crowd would part and he would sit around, and everybody sat around him and just listen to him. We don't have things. We're losing that type of reverence and that type of honor for fatherhood and motherhood and the structure of family. And even as far as that is concerned, I believe that that's a part of being Americanized.
Sure.
So how do we shake and cleanse ourselves of this Americanized way of functioning and being as a people?
Sure.
Because I think that's at the forefront of us getting back to who we were created to be.
Sure.
And us tapping into
Yeah.
all that we have on the inside of us.
Well, I tell you what, once again, I think that there's no more powerful. There are two very powerful places in America in the Black community: the pulpit and the media. Okay. And if we can reclaim those identities through those two spaces, I give a perfect example. I think Kwanzaa is a wonderful, wonderful example of a reclaiming of a cultural tradition and heritage and a creation of a new sort of African-American space to build family during a season that is so capitalistic and so materialistic, and to say, let's talk about unity, let's talk about community, let's talk about self-determination. The family structure and community structure is extremely African. In South Africa, I take my students to the South African consulate every semester, and we go and we visit the consulate general, and we have this wonderful conversation. And last semester we were there, and they taught us about this principle called Ubuntu. And what this principle means is basically what that word essentially means is we all are one. Okay, so as I rise, you rise, we all rise together. And so this notion of community has been stripped from us as Americans, right? The Asian cultures, they're much more community driven. If you look at Japanese culture particularly, people will commit suicide before they dishonor their family. So if you look at what's happened for us from 1619 to now, there have been basically, I told you 70% of our kids grew up without a father in the home. There have been 5 historic reasons why our families have been decimated in our communities. Number one, slavery ripped the families apart. Slavery changed the notion of the role of the male and female in the family. Women were able to be breadwinners, men were not. And so once again, you will see in America, Black women are doing way better than Black men are, because historically Black men have been considered and so you won't find another community in this country where women are doing better, where women are supporting and that sort of thing. And so that flipped the role, and it changed the nature of community and family, so that women didn't need men in the same way, which ultimately has had deleterious impact on our community. Number two, if you look at the 60s, there was a sexual revolution, and the sexual revolution in America ultimately said that this notion of fidelity, this notion of monogamy, is countercultural to what we believe in as Americans. Well, Americans hopped in and said we believe that, and unfortunately, Black Americans hopped in as much as anyone else, maybe even worse than some other folks in certain ways, and we're suffering more from it. Maybe we didn't participate more, but our suffering is greater because we needed our families more than they needed their families, right? If you look at the welfare policies of the 60s and 70s, they said that a man cannot be in the home if women wanted to receive welfare benefits. So this began to tear apart the family. Mass incarceration, starting in the 70s, put Black males out of the home. The United States has the largest prison population in the world by far. We have 2 times as many people in prison as the Chinese do. The Chinese have 1 billion people. We only have 300 million. You can go to China to jail in China for having a church service in your house. So in America, the land of the free, we have more people incarcerated than any place in the world. And unfortunately, the people who are mostly incarcerated are people that look like you and I. African-American males make up 6% of the population, close to 50% of the people in prison. Last but not least, in the 1970s, there was this policy called no-fault divorce. Once no-fault divorce coming out of California under the Reagan administration came to the national level, it shot divorce numbers through the roof in America immediately. We have the highest rate of divorce of any place in the world, about 50%. So if you put all those together, you basically have a perfect storm to destroy the family. 70% of our kids grow up without a father in the home. So what do we have to do? I tell people all the time, it's not just the issue of behavior, it's also an issue of public policy. Public policy partially got us into this mess. Public policy can partially get us out, but we have to reclaim a culture of family, which comes from the African tradition. There is community there. America, not just Black America, but America is an individualistic nation in which we are better when we achieve individually. And what we have to do is say, no, no, no. We are only better if we rise together.
Love it. I don't know. Many of you are probably like, Annette is like really quiet today, and not many people come on and make me speechless.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Even when just ending on that note, we're better when we come together, and then coupling that with the piece that you introduced on the sexual revolution. Where do you feel like and this may be controversial, but like the feminist movement and feminism and that
Sure.
belief, how can you see a correlation with that, its origin, and how it may have subsequently dismantled or been a part of what dismantled the Black family?
Sure, I would argue yes, but I would argue the feminism movement really was separate from the struggle of African Americans. So people adopted the principles of feminism, but those were not necessarily your same issues. European American women, I don't like the terms Black and white, by the way. I write about this in the book because I think they're pejorative, they're negative. That the word Black is in the English language as evil as you possibly can get. We wear black at funerals, we wear white at weddings, right? And white is a superior concept term, and so I prefer to use the concepts of African American or European American, that sort of thing, so that we don't replicate, I think, bad language. And so, but I would say women of European descent had a much different struggle. The feminism movement resulted in European women getting affirmative action, which ultimately was supposed to be for African Americans. And so when African Americans embrace those principles, I'm all for equality and that sort of thing. But they have to put it in context, and they've got to say, yes, I am strong, I'm independent, I'm with you, I married an independent woman, I was raised by an independent woman. You understand what I'm saying? I get it, okay? I fully get it, okay? You ain't gonna tell my wife or my mother anything in some days, and I respect that, and I love it. And they've had to have that strength in this country because they've had to take care of things in this country that other women have not had to do. So we've got to parse them out and separate the goals of the European American feminism movement from the African American feminism movement. Yes, African American women can be strong, but the ultimate goal is not to be by yourself, is not to raise by yourself, is not to build by yourself, but to build with a partner. Now, our men have to do better as well. Ultimately, African American men have been the most targeted, most hated, as the rappers from the early 80s and 90s called public enemy number one. They have been. We all know this, and I love this country. I'm blessed by this country, but let's call a spade a spade. The reality is that African American men have been systematically oppressed since the time we've gotten to this country. The Constitution itself says that slavery is still legal. And when they created that, they were literally arresting people for walking down the street the wrong way, throwing them in jail for 20 years so that they could have a labor source. American capitalism has always only worked from cheap and free labor. We went from European indentured servants. We went to Native Americans. Neither one of those lasted. African slaves, that lasted for a couple hundred years. Then after that ended, we had to have a cheap labor source, so we put them all in jail. Then once we got done with that, now we're dealing with the immigrant question. And now we're talking about all these people who are mad, people are coming across the border. Why are you mad at the immigrants? Well, you're not mad at the people who are hiring them. Maybe if you prosecuted the people who were hiring them, you wouldn't be trying to shut it down at the border. But everyone knows that, and it's because we like cheap and free stuff in this country. We live off of immigrant labor. And then on top of that, most of the stuff that we have in this country is not made here anyway, because we can't afford to pay Americans who want $10 an hour to make your iPad. We have to pay people in China $10 a week to make those so we can have access to the benefits of capitalism. So what I'm saying is that African Americans have heavily suffered from this exploitation economically. How do we change that? We have to begin to empower ourselves to take advantage of the economic opportunities that exist. I would suggest particularly African American males need to be the greatest entrepreneurs in this country, because we typically have the hardest time blending in to mainstream corporate America.
Okay. This is good.
You
That was a
laid
great
it out.
question. That was a great question.
Great answer.
Yes, great response there. Okay, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to let me recognize a few people here on Facebook, and I'm so sorry you guys have just got so involved. Michelle Thomas, thank you for watching. Brandy, Beatrice Carter, thank you for watching. Demetria Brand Triplet, and she did have a comment on here earlier. Nicole, I see you watching as well, Sanctuary Owner, because I do have some business owners that are watching, and that's another question I want to kind of talk to you about. You mentioned about entrepreneurship earlier, and I kind of want to ask that after we take our break. Demetria's comment here, she said he's telling the truth. We set trends and standards for the world, but we just don't pull our economics together, to make moves for ourselves as a culture of people. And so I believe it was something you were saying totally in the beginning, and she was just in agreement with that. And that's just something we definitely have to keep in mind. Now, I want you to think about this question, and I'm going to take a quick break about about entrepreneurs. I'm glad you just said that about African American males need to be the ones who, go and make it happen, so to speak, in that area. And I'm in total agreement with you. My mentality always, and I know that you as African American much, and urge you all, and motivate you all in whatever way I can as African American woman, because you are the head, and if I look at it in the sense of, how the word states, I mean, that's how I should look at it. You are. So that's always been my mentality to, motivate you all in that way. So yes, I'm in agreement with that statement about the African American males need to be, the ones that would, basically start this thing off, so to speak, is what you're saying, as entrepreneurs. So we want to talk about that when we come back, more of your take on it. And I also want to ask about a little bit further about the church's involvement, what they should be doing. You said that's a way for us to move forward, because church is not, sometimes they're not necessarily doing what they should be doing. I'm trying to say it as nice as I can.
You're doing a good job. Just say it. Yeah.
You're doing a good job of it.
Because, that's who we're looking to. We have to have our things in order. We definitely do. So if you're just not tuning in, you listen to Mind, Body, and Soul with Annette. Today's topic, again, is the agenda for uplifting Black America. My guest here is Ted Williams III. And of course, we're joined by Apostle Hunt, and we're having a hot discussion. Well, he's having a hot discussion, and I'm listening on today. This is great stuff here. We're going to take a quick break here. We'll be back for more of Mind, Body, and Soul with Annette right here on Intellectual Radio.
And worship is what we do. We love to praise. We must go to that place before we can leave you. So let us worship Him in spirit, worship Him in truth. For all that He's already done and everything He will do, because great happens when shepherds worship, and miracles happen when shepherds praise. Everybody needs to know great things happen when shepherds worship. Victory happens when our hands are raised.
Nehemiah 8:6 says that Ezra praised the Lord, the great God, and all the people shouted, Amen, as they lifted their hands. Then they bowed down with their faces to the ground and they worshiped the Lord. I want everybody under the sound of my voice right now to help us say, We give you praise. All of our days is to you. That our hands are raised. Hallelujah. We give you praise, God. We give you glory for who you are. Come on, help us say it tonight. We give you praise. All of our days is to you. That our hands are raised. We lift our hands in worship. We lift our hands in praise, and we give you glory. We give you praise. All of our days, it is to you. It is to you. Our hands are raised. Our hands are raised. When we think of all you've done, when we think of your goodness, we lift our hands in praise. We lift our hands and we worship you. We lift our hands in praise. We praise you, Lord, for all that you do. We lift our hands in praise. There's nobody like you, Jesus. You're worthy of all the glory. We worship you. We worship you, our King.
All right, welcome back. Welcome back to Mind, Body, and Soul with Annette. We're here on Intellectual Radio, and I am your host, Annette Harris. And if you are just now joining us, you have missed quite a treat, but we are still here until 2 o'clock here today. So we're talking with our guest, Ted Williams, the third. I always like to say that. Sure, I get the third in there. Because
Thank
you have
you.
the fourth,
Well,
and there was a one and a two.
there was and then the two. So he'll appreciate this separation.
The distinction
And then
there.
the other one, the 4, he definitely appreciates it because he tells everybody he's 7 that my name is Theodore. I'm not my father, and I'm the 4th. So you need to understand that.
Is
So
that right?
he's firm in his identity already.
That's
Wow.
wonderful.
Which I love.
Well, I mean, I can't. I mean, obviously, he gets it from you.
Yeah.
That's a good thing.
Yeah.
Okay,
So
great. So I asked you a couple things before we went on our break,
Mhm.
and wanted to know your thoughts. Maybe you can kind of continue expounding what we were talking about in terms of entrepreneurship with the African American males,
Mhm.
and tell me your thoughts on that and how we
absolutely.
can get that going.
So we have this system in this country where when you get a felony, you are unemployable. To people is that they go into the prison industrial complex, which is a for-profit entity, by the way, which we don't talk about very often as well, which is, to me, very immoral.
Mhm.
And I've got some friends on Facebook who disagree with that. So if they're watching, we could talk about this one later. But it's immoral. So what happens then is that these folks come back to these communities. What are they supposed to do?
Mhm.
Well, if you cannot figure out a way to engage in the marketplace, then you are going to turn back to a life of crime.
Absolutely.
So the number one greatest group for entrepreneurship to me is African American males. But number two, and as you see, by the way, from 2002 to 2007, our entrepreneurship numbers went up 18%, higher than any group in the country, which is promising. But we're still lower in terms of our access to capital, our access to entrepreneurial ventures, that sort of thing, than other groups. So we have a lot of work to still do. I tell this story, a friend of mine told me this story, and I love it because it encapsulates what we ought to be thinking about. We oftentimes are looking at the disrespect that we receive in businesses, and our folks culturally, we keep it real. Okay, so culturally, African American, and this is not. I mean, these are not stereotypes. These are cultural sort of proclivities, right? Asian cultures tend to be a lot more reserved and quiet, and so you won't necessarily see a lot of overt action in Asian cultures. Watch Asian worship, that sort of thing, and other cultures as well. African Americans are very demonstrative. African people are very demonstrative, and so when someone disrespects us, we let them know. But I think it's time for us to begin to let people know in a different way, right? I think it's time for us to have a more mature and healthy way of letting people know that we're being disrespected. So the story goes like this. There was a buddy of mine told me the story. He had a friend who was a Jewish man. And he was in this club at a particular time, and the owner of the club was anti-Semitic. And so he was saying things about Jewish people and acting in a way where he was discriminating against the guy because he found out he was Jewish, and all these things were happening. And so his friend was very upset, and he left the club. Now, think about how we would respond to this, right? We stay at the club, we curse them out, we, da 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 da, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, right? The guy comes back the very next day, and guess what he does? He bought the club.
Whoa.
See.
That's economic power.
Mhm.
That's respect.
Mhm.
That's what we have to do. In America, people do not respect you if you don't have economic power. So while we're talking about whether the mayor is nice to us or whether CNN is nice to us or whether Fox is nice to us, we have to learn how to buy the club.
Love it.
And we have to value the fact that we have economic power to begin with. So even if I don't have the means to buy the club, I can stop patronizing the
That's
club.
true. That's true.
And just little things like that. If we don't see the value and the power and what we have and what we bring to this community, to the economic
Mhm.
world,
Yeah.
then we'll miss it.
Absolutely.
That's it.
Absolutely. And so when you look at particularly a city like Chicago, Chicago has the largest population of African Americans in the country.
Mm.
And New York has a larger population of quote unquote Black people, but those quote unquote Black people are from the Caribbean, they're from Africa. Because during the Great Migration, Chicago was the largest destination for people from the South. We have the largest population of African Americans in the country, which, ladies and gentlemen, is a huge economic base, a huge political. Again, stop looking at Chicago, stop looking at African people, particularly this community, as a situation of a glass half empty. This glass is very half full. I would suggest it's getting to the point where it's more than just half full, right? With the amount of resources that we have here. Do you recognize that there's no person in the city that could ever get elected to be mayor of Chicago without coming through the Black community, without getting support from the Black pastors, without getting support from the Black businesses and luminaries? When you look at businesses in this city, you can't really do business in the city unless you play with the Black aldermen in some way and sit perform. So once again, when we begin, and this is once again back to the church, when we elect leadership, not based on style, but on substance. When we elect leadership, not based on what they look like on the outside, but what they look like on the inside. Isn't that what God said about Saul, right? He said that, you wanted Saul, we chose Saul, but God does not look at what's on the outside. Man looks at what's on the outside, but God looks at the heart. So when we begin to look at our leaders and hold them to a moral, ethical standard, that's why the church is relevant. Anybody say, oh, well, it don't matter what he think about this social issue, that it's all about jobs. No, it does matter what he thinks about the social issue. It does matter what his character is, because if he doesn't have strong character, then he won't be able to serve us well. There was this principle. President Roosevelt said that once again, just like Dr. King, knowledge and power, those principles, that if we educate a man in the mind, this is Theodore Roosevelt speaking, president of the turn of the century, the early 1900s, if we educate a man in the mind and not the morals, we educate a menace to society. And so we've got to hold our leadership accountable. Does that start with? It starts with people of faith. Now, I know we're going to talk about this later. That means we got to hold people in the church accountable too.
Yes.
And that's a whole other conversation.
Oh my goodness. I almost want to hop right on over there real quick. But let's see, there was something you were saying. Okay. You mentioned about, and I'll just go back.
Mhm.
You have to learn how to buy the club.
Yes.
But then again, how do we get,
Gangster.
you know where I'm going?
That's gangster.
Oh.
I mean, why you
How do
crying?
we get
You know what I
them
mean?
there mentally? Because they're like, really? That's a big thing to them.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
It's easier for them to just walk out
Mm-hmm.
and, like you said, cuss them out or whatever, or handle it their own way. That to them, I show them.
Mhm.
And I'm,
Yeah.
but no, if you buy the club, that would be showing them.
Absolutely.
How do we get them there?
So it starts by supporting local businesses. I love going to Walmart just like anybody else, or going to Target like anyone else. But you all saw Target doesn't care about this community.
No.
What just happened 2 weeks ago? Target
Right.
is pulling
Pulling them.
Targets out of the South Side
Absolutely.
because they're not profitable for them. So at the end of the day, Target doesn't care about you. But these local businesses, and I know we have challenges with local businesses. I really do. I understand that, right? But whenever we can, right? So for instance, at Christmas time, I try to, particularly because it's the biggest consumer period in America. There's I go to this mall out in River Oaks sometimes when my wife works in that area. And so there's a couple of African American vendors that I've made friends with over the years, and we come by and I always buy from them. Always. Why? Because they're selling art and they're selling culture and they're selling,
Yeah.
and I would rather give my family a gift that represents that than go and buy them a t-shirt from Walmart or something from Target. So I'm saying these are small ways that we can say, you know what, I'm going to support people. And maybe, and I'll be frank with you, sometimes our businesses are not what they need to be. Okay. But that's not always the case. And once again, that's back to that psychosis of self-hatred. I grew up, and I'm going to tell you all this. My father is, God bless my father, still
Yeah.
thing, is a entrepreneur Black businessman. My father never worked for anyone a day in my life. When I was a kid, actually, that's not true. It's past the time when I was 11. When I was a kid, he was a car salesman over on Stony Island at a place called Bob Neal Pontiac. Then when I was 11, he got into a dealer training program. By the time I was 12, he had his own car dealership, Lincoln, Mercury, Nissan, Saab, and Hyundai in Mishawaka, Indiana. No Black people there. My father had, okay, Mishawaka, yeah.
I bought a car from there before.
Did you really?
Yes.
Did you really?
Yes.
In Mishawaka?
Yes.
Do you know where you bought it from?
I can't remember the name of it.
You might have bought it from my dad.
Maybe.
Maybe. We'll figure that one out after the show.
Okay.
But so 45 employees, 2 African Americans, and then him. He named the dealership Shamrock Lincoln Mercury. He named it Shamrock because he did not want them to know that he owned it. So it was an Irish Catholic town. Do you really?
I grew up in Elkhart, Indiana.
Oh my
which is
gosh.
next door.
Yeah, that's
Oh
crazy.
my
You grew up in
gosh.
Elkhart?
Yes.
Wow. See, I didn't know. That's crazy. Wow.
See,
That's
it's a small
weird.
world.
Isn't it a small world? Shamrock Mercury.
Okay.
He came from Chicago, moved there. And so what he did was he built this dealership, and for close to 20 years, he was, this very successful businessman. So then my father leaves the car business is going down. He's stressed, this and that, whatever. I'm off of college. I've moved on, whatever. My brother's moved out. That's just 2 of us, and my mom's still there. And then he decides that he's going to take a couple of years off, reinvent himself, and he went and bought a McDonald's. And then he bought another McDonald's. And now he's a McDonald's owner, a franchisor. And so, franchise owner. And so, and my dad has always taught me, he said, you'll never really make a living well if you're working for someone else. So I went to school, I got my degrees, I have a great job, but I also have a job that allows me the flexibility to do other things. And what do I do? What does my brother do? My brother owns 3, 4, 5, 6 pieces of property in the city. I, do my business. I do this teaching and books and theater, and, and I'm working in the corporate training space, and it's entrepreneurship.
Yes.
And so what I recognize, and I think once again, many of us, this is not new to our community. Many of us hold a job and then we got a little, what do we call it, a side hustle.
Right.
We call it a side hustle.
Yes.
That's entrepreneurship. And if we can build
That's
those
exactly
things.
what it is.
And I'll tell you what, I'll get to Africa in a second, because I think it's very important to see what's happening. During the 1990s, Bill Clinton recognized that he wanted to create a partnership with Africa to move Africa from a relationship of aid to a relationship of trade. So what did he do? They built this thing called the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which is known as AGOA. They began to start trading with Africa. Well, one of the things that Clinton thought, and people, you think about the history, Clinton's got some good stuff, some bad stuff. But one of the things that he wanted to do was he wanted to put forward and invest in what's called microcredit. What is microcredit? Microcredit was developed by this Peruvian economist named Hernando de Soto, who argued that we should invest in the poorest people, not the wealthiest. So why is it when you go get a business loan, they want to see if you already have money? If I had money, I wouldn't need a loan. Yes. If my credit was great,
Right.
I wouldn't need you necessarily, right? So it's counterintuitive if you think about it.
True.
So we give money, we give money to those who have the most, right? So what this principle does, microcredit, is they invest the largest numbers of dollars in small businesses that cannot get access to capital. They give them loans that are targeted particularly for maybe someone is selling some CDs out their car or whatever, they want to build to the next level. That's what microcredit does. So Clinton, this Peruvian economist, they sort of piloted this in Africa. It began to grow. Right now, microcredit in Africa is really pushing the economic agenda in Africa. Some people brought that back to America. In fact, there even is a microcredit program here in the city of Chicago under the Emmanuel administration, where it would take small businesses and give them give them loans and money. So what I'm saying is that when we look at how we get out of the mess we're in, we have to look at and support people when we vote, push policies like that, who say, okay, what is your agenda? I hear everything you're saying, JB. I hear everything, okay? I hear everything you're saying, Tony Preckwinkle. I hear everything you're saying, Willie Wilson. I hear everything you're saying. But what is your agenda to uplift the least of these? Isn't that what the Bible says? How we will be judged in this world is based on how we treat the least of these. So let's take our resources and let's push them into the most dilapidated communities, and let's give them the capital to start their own businesses. Whether they rise or fall, businesses are always falling. It's okay. Right. But you've got to invest in there so that we can begin to turn the tide.
Wow. You know, as you were talking and even talking about your parents and everything, I just had to reflect back. My parents were entrepreneurs. They didn't work outside jobs. My mom was a hairstylist for years. She owned her own beauty shop and everything. And my dad, he was a barber. And then he, went and did some other things, as well. I think he had a food truck. That was when it was like really just getting going. Then at that point, now they have the like little things out now, taco trucks and this, that, and the other. But they were entrepreneurs. And sometimes my sisters and I, we talk, we tell each other, we this is in our blood,
Absolutely.
And so we need to capitalize on this and make this thing like really, really happen, for us. And don't let it just, go by the wayside. Well, okay, they did it.
We would be surprised at, it literally is in your blood. I mean, when you think about what we had to do to survive. My grandfather started his own trucking company with a third grade education. Wow. And when I say that man was wealthy.
Wow.
And when I look at my father and my uncles and even my mother, I'm seeing how we were so creative in how I was an engineer for 15 years, but that just wasn't cutting it for me.
Okay.
You see, and so I had to do something different. And so, but I also want to bring this up concerning even just blacks in corporate America. Even though I made it to corporate America and I was very good at what I did, I was treated differently.
Absolutely.
I was treated differently. There were certain projects that were, people tried to steer them away from me because for whatever reason, I don't know if they thought maybe I was not going to do a good job, or maybe they just didn't want to give me the opportunity, but they steered from me. And I literally had to fight for work, even though I had a job. I had to fight for certain projects. I had to ask them, give me the hard task.
Wow. Just
so I can feel like I was proving myself and being seen as someone who was on an even playing field with my other counterparts. You see, so that those are the things that we deal with that go unsaid, that you don't necessarily see, or that we don't talk about, and it kind of forces us into this mentality. Well, maybe I should be doing something for myself, because every time I came to work, every time I pulled into the parking lot, I was grieved at what I was going to have to deal with, making good money, but just grieved at just how people viewed me and dealt with me. They didn't want to let me go, but they weren't treating me like I was like everybody else,
Interesting.
So
I see you guys joining in here on Facebook Live, and I see a number of entrepreneurs on here, African American entrepreneurs on here. And I do thank you for joining us. We're talking about the agenda for uplifting Black America on today. And we kind of got stuck a little bit talking about entrepreneurs, and I'm glad we got stuck there. I'm here with Ted Williams III and also Apostle Dion Hunt. Deborah Brown, thank you for watching and joining us on today. Elder McGee, greetings to you as well. Angela Elaine, Madeline, Ward Friedman, excuse me. Will Colquitt, that's an African American radio. He's a producer, actually, has his own radio station. Thank you for watching on today. Pastor Lockhart, we appreciate you for joining us on today. And Madeline's in agreement, saying yes, support local businesses, and she's enjoying what she's hearing on today. So, you guys, thank you for your comments on today. You can go ahead, if you're just now coming in, go ahead and like and share this live feed. We would appreciate it. And you can also continue to make your comments. Had asked you about the church. I don't know, I kind of got stuck on entrepreneurs, but I did ask you about the church. Maybe we can kind of, and it'd be a hard segue. We can segue into that to discuss what the responsibility of the church is. That is a way that we need to view to move forward. The church is sometimes the church limits itself.
Mm-hmm.
How can we get beyond that? What should be the church's responsibility in helping to uplift this African American agenda?
Well, I know our pastor here will definitely jump in on this one. I'll just start, and I've served in ministry capacities and variety of spaces over my lifetime because I've always really believed in the church and was raised in a God-fearing home, and so I understand why the church is critical. But when I think about the church, I think about holistic ministry. I think about the idea that, people are sometimes you got people who are, prosperity ministry, people who are against prosperity ministry, people who are this kind of, and I'm like, honestly, folks, let's be mature.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The Bible talks about avoiding all extremes. Let's be mature and let's understand that God, yes, wants us to be prosperous. Yes, wants us to give. Yes, wants us to do this. Yes, wants us to do that. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. And so we're able to not fully negate the ministries that try to uplift people, but we understand that God's number one goal is not for us to be rich on this earth. Okay. So that's biblically very clear as well. If that were the case, Jesus would have preached a whole lot differently than he did. Right. So Jesus was constantly with the marginalized. You'll never find really any time in scripture where Jesus is much more likely or God more likely to side with those who are wealthy versus those who were destitute, right? So the churches have to teach holistically. There are many churches, and I will say this, and I write about this in the book, by the way, there are many churches that I think are doing an amazing job in terms of teaching people about finances and teaching people about relationships and teaching people about how do you engage in the community and teaching people how do you be a responsible parent. I would tell you right now, if it was not for the church, I don't know what kind of husband and father I would be. You understand what I'm saying? Because I've had mentors in the church who set me down and said, brother, this is what we went through. And you got to, and I know it's hard, but this is, bring them to church and then you sit them down, give them their snack afterwards. I know it's hard. It takes 3 hours to get out the house. You know what I mean? But it's worth it because the kids know. And now my kids are, very involved in ministry in the school and, that sort of thing. And we were in the car on the way to school this morning and my son is quoting theologians, my 7-year-old, who I've talked about the purposes of Christmas and why it's important to keep Christ at Christmas, and he knows this stuff. And I'm like, that's amazing, right? Because he recognizes the need for God. It's at the source. So with the ministries that I'm excited about are those equipping ministries, those equipping churches, those that empower folks to get out and be their best and uplift the community. And those that talk about, theologically, the notions of social justice. We can't sit on the sideline. And I'm not suggesting once again that every time someone comes to your church that it's all about politics. No, I'm not saying that either. But I am saying that there are some very clear political and social issues that theologically are very clear. I spoke at my church 2 weeks ago, did a conference on justice, and we talked about the woman caught in adultery and how that was a issue of social justice. When you look at how Jesus looked at how the Pharisees were interpreting the law about stoning, they were acting in an unjust manner in their interpretation of the law, because if they were really interpreted correctly, they would have gotten a man up there with her, but they were not. So what do you do when you see somebody violating the law? You stand up and you speak up. That's what the prophets of God did, right? So why would we then see somebody unjustly interpreting the law and go, well, that ain't my business. I just worry about, praying and it'll be okay. No, once again, yeah, we got to pray. Yeah, God's in control. Yes, he is the ultimate purveyor of justice. But throughout the scriptures, he used men and women of God to step up and speak truth to power.
Absolutely.
So I'll let you go ahead, listen, brother.
Well, you made some very, very interesting points. You know, when we see injustices, we have to have answers. I'm noticing and understanding that people come to church, they want answers, even concerning certain things that they're seeing and
Absolutely.
experiencing in the world and seeing in the media. They want to know what the church has to say. And if we're getting up Sunday after Sunday just giving our favorite sermon and not speaking to, you know, whatever issues that are plaguing our society, then we're not really ministering to them. And we have to learn how, you know, we have this saying that you can be so heavenly minded that you're no earthly good. And we have to learn as ministry gifts to minister to the total man, spirit, soul, and body, not just to feed and pour all this stuff into your spirit and then give you no means or no understanding or no plan to take what I just deposited in you spiritually and make it manifest naturally. And I think that's the disconnect. We don't value as a whole, we don't value secular credentials enough. And so, you know, we'll take peace and mental peace, for example. We'll deal with peace and mental peace, and we'll have all these scriptures, and we'll preach a wonderful sermon, but then we don't direct people to proper resources to give them the tools to be healed. You know, and I think it's what we have to do as a church is we have to produce that missing piece of the puzzle and connect spirituality with natural manifestation. You know, churches, we ought to have um, um, programs for certain communities. We ought to have programs to preach, not just preach against the poor or preach against poverty, rather, but we ought to have programs that feed the poor. You see, and so those are things that I think that there are so many churches that are we're missing out on pure ministry. My church was in a community for years, in the Roseland community on the corner of 106th and Perry for years, and that was an impoverished community, not just poverty ridden, but impoverished, meaning that the people there couldn't even see their way out. And so what do? You don't just show up Sunday after Sunday and slay folk in the spirit and then leave. No, you want that community to be better because you're there. And so the way that we saw it is that, hey, you're not going to be hungry on our watch. You're not going to need certain resources. And we're here
Right.
with the gospel. And we don't do anything to help on our watch. And so we had a job readiness program in the hot months, in the summer months. And so we were constantly coming up with ideas to minister to the community and take church outside of the four walls. We get so used to having church in amongst ourselves. We prophesy to the same people. We lay hands on the same people. We preach to the same people, and we're waiting on people to come in new as opposed to going out and doing something. And Jesus dealt with that when he cursed the fig tree. In that parable where he cursed the fig tree was a representation of the religious system. And so he's saying, okay, we're looking at a tree. It has leaves, it has a tree trunk, it has branches, but it bears no fruit. And so we're looking at churches nowadays. It has a steeple, it has a choir, it has pews, it has a platform, but where is the fruit? Where are we producing the fruit? Because it's the fruit that's going to feed the people. And so that's the mindset that the church has to get into in this day and age. We have to get rid of that disconnect between the gospel that we're preaching and the natural need in the. How do we connect it? How do we connect it?
And I love, once again, as critical as the world is of the church. there's no greater place to do this kind of work than out of the
Absolutely.
church.
Absolutely.
Why? Because people have an external motivation that really has nothing to do with them, right? So what other people in the society are going to just do good just because it's good, not because they benefit, not because someone's patting them on the back, but because they believe that ultimately that their God who's watching them is
Mhm.
going to bless them. I'll give you guys a quick story about something that happened to us last night. So my wife works for a church, and I'll go ahead and put this out there because I think it's very important. You guys know about the security guard that just was
Mhm.
murdered in Midlothian.
Yes.
Yeah, Midlothian, right? Yeah. I don't want to say the wrong
Is-
municipality. Was it
Mar-
Midlothian?
Markham?
No,
No, it
it
wasn't
was
Markham.
it was
It
in
was
Robbins, but it was Midlothian
yeah, it was
police
Midlothian.
officer.
Thank you. Okay,
Okay.
cool. I don't want to indict the wrong.
Right.
I want to say Tinley Park or it was Country Club Hills. Somebody call it, who works for Country Club Hills, get upset with us.
Okay.
So the gentleman who, the security officer who was killed, grew up in the church that my wife works for.
Wow.
And so the pastor, knew him, raised him, trained him in his security business. The pastor had a security business. Pastor and his son trained the young man into the business. He went into security because of these influences, right? So it really hit the church very heavily. It's our second church home, we call it. We have a church home, but we go there oftentimes because we are connected.
Mhm.
My wife and my kids are in the building 5-6 days a week. So we're very connected with the church
Right.
family there. They oftentimes like, how come y'all went to church? We don't even go to this church, but they always looking for us every week. Like, you know what I mean? So,
That's me.
you know what I mean? Like, wait a second, how come you
You
went here?
know?
We don't go here.
Right.
So sometimes, so this is what happened yesterday. There was a church in Midlothian, a European American Lutheran church, that called the church yesterday, and somehow they got my wife's number. My wife runs a school. Somehow I didn't make it to the church. But the school, we're in our car, and she's on her phone. And they called to say, "Hey, listen, we're in Midlothian, and we are a predominantly, white church, and we heard what happened, and we heard that this was his spiritual home, and we wanted to just call to be a blessing." And we wanted to
Wow.
say that, is there anything that we can do? What can we pray for you for? How can we serve you during this? You understand what I'm
That's
saying?
community. Yeah.
You understand what I'm saying? That's the church.
Yeah.
That's what the church has to offer.
Absolutely.
In a way,
Compassion.
absolutely, in a way that is multi-ethnic, multi-generational, multi-economic status, right? And so for me, when I say that, I think, wow, God, there's still hope in your people. Like, yeah, they're sinful, yeah, we crazy, yeah, this and that. But when I see things like that pastor had no motivation
Right.
to call
He
us
didn't have
out of the
to.
blue, right? And it almost made my wife cry when she was on the phone talking to them. And I said, that is the gospel. And if we can show that to the world more, I think that we can change the world.
I think so. And I think the key, and you all have said it, when we as a church recognize and understand really simply enough what people are going through, if we're observant and watching them, those that come into your congregation, be observant, seeing what they're dealing with, because and you said it earlier too, sometimes people, they want to deal with the here and now, what I'm going through right now. How can you help me? Basically, as opposed to, everything else, all the fanfare. They want to deal with the here and now. I'm going through this. What can you help me with? And as a church, and I do see more churches nowadays there, with the different programs and different things like that, trying to help the homeless, those that are in need, trying to put practices in place, to help the people, and not just, like you say, you're in every Sunday in those four walls, you're just talking to each other. There's so many needs outside. And I always say, get out of the four walls, go out, help the people. There's so many that need help. There's so many, which is really the premise of the show. There's so many that are going through mentally, dealing with so many different mental illnesses. And they come into your church. A lot of people that are even in your choirs, they're going through.
Absolutely.
They're going through mentally. They're fighting things themselves. So we have to be understanding and know. And maybe sometimes, I do this. Put yourself into someone's position. not literally, you know what I mean.
Mm.
Put yourself in their shoes to kind of understand what they're dealing with and what they're good, and then that way you can try and get your resources together and put your things in order,
Mm.
in place. And then also knowing, as a church, what you are capable of or what
Yes.
you can do and what you cannot do. Now, if you are, we had a call the other day,
Mhm.
individual who was counseling.
Mhm.
I think were they a pastor?
They
Um,
were an evangelist.
an
Yeah.
evangelist, and they were counseling. Some individuals. They've come. I think she said she had been overwhelmed with counseling,
Mhm.
and I just wanted to ask her a question. I said, do you have a degree in that, or is that your area of expertise? So we have to know individuals' expertise in their
Mhm.
areas as well. So we can't just pull out Sister Bobo and just tell her to go and counsel. She
Mhm.
has no
No. Yeah.
knowledge,
Yeah.
of what to do. And you can't just say, "Oh yeah, I went through this one thing, so maybe I can counsel her on." No, get the professionals in order.
Mhm.
And I believe God has placed people,
Absolutely.
in certain areas to do certain things. I don't know how to get off on that, but that's
Mhm.
okay. But that's okay. And so I think, yeah, I'm glad you both addressed that, because yes, the church has an awesome responsibility, and I think we're going to be held accountable. I
Absolutely.
believe we are. I know we
Absolutely.
are. And so, and my thing is, if people come into your church, they're burdened down, they're going through different things, you don't want them to leave back out the same
You don't. You know.
or take something else with them.
And compassion is the key word. And he was just talking about that. Do we have the ability to feel one another? We say that we have the Holy Spirit, and I'm not questioning anybody's profession of that. But if the Holy Spirit makes you compassionate, it makes you to where you feel the other person with a desire to help or assist. And what I found out in ministry is that the more and more that you do that, in my experience, the more and more that God shows up in the ministry or the service toward your fellow man. Jesus was a multitude. It took a miracle for him to do it. But even as far as that is concerned, I've seen situations where we just had it in our heart in other ministries, even had it in their heart to be a blessing to people in need, and God showed up in that effort and caused something to happen that they could not have done in and of themselves. And so I believe that God blesses, we consider the poor. The Bible says it plainly, blessed is he that considers the poor. And so we have to consider those who are less fortunate, not just financially, but in body and in mind. So I think that's
Definitely.
awesome.
Did you want to add anything to
No,
that?
I think he hit it right on the head.
Okay. Okay. This is good stuff. I am so appreciative of this conversation on today. Let's see, Shamika Scott, thank you for watching. And I think that we actually have a spoken word from Elder Kevin McGee. Elder Kevin McGee has a show here on Saturdays at 12 o'clock noon Central Standard Time on at Intellectual Radio. It's entitled Connections.
Mm.
And every week, he normally supplies mind, body, and soul with a spoken word, which is pertinent to the topic of the day. So let's take a listen.
People often talk about what is the black agenda. What do we as a people want? Reparations? Not really. But what we want, America, is for you to step into our shoes. The shoes of the most hated and misused and abused race there has ever been. Because to understand our agenda, you have to be us. And because some of you can't relate, you find yourself stymied by the fact that you can live where you want to live and we can't. You can walk into a store without suspicion and we can't. You can have peaceful police interactions with no threat of being killed and we can't. So if you want to know our agenda, walk in our shoes and know what it feels like to be called certain words that have been used to degrade us. What is our agenda? Maybe it's to be able to be judged by the content of our character and not by our skin. Maybe it's not having resources segregated that only privileged individuals have access to. Maybe it's being able to live anywhere without the threat of harassment from barbecue Patty, poolside Penny, walking the dog Wendy, closing the car door Carol, and just waking up in the morning Wanda, or other self-proclaimed heroes of the community. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Are these words hollow? Yes, there is a way out of the quagmire that this world is in. And the answer is not in any agenda, but it's in the Creator who created us in His image and likeness. And if we grab hold to this answer, no agenda is necessary.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Elder McGee. Gentlemen, what are your thoughts on that spoken word there?
I love it.
Love it.
Yeah, I love it.
Okay.
It just reminds me of the scripture that says that if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven. I will forgive them their sins, and I will heal their land. And I think about when it comes down, when all's said and done, I have degrees in public policy and I teach politics and that sort of thing. But when it's all said and done, there's nothing greater than God's restoration.
Absolutely.
And I want, I love our people. I love our country. I really do. I don't know too many African Americans who are anti-patriotic, as they try to label in the media. African Americans, once again, what could be more patriotic than to give your life for a country that hates you? Right?
Indeed.
To go and serve in a war where you come back home and you can't even walk down the street. So I think African Americans have shown patriotism over the years and continue to. African Americans don't want to leave and go to Africa. That's just not sort of, for the majority of people in this country, is not a viable option. So we're here. What do we do? How do we live in this multi-cultural enclave that is known as this country? And I think that we have to hold our systems accountable. We have to teach people how to treat us. I think it's very important. We have to treat ourselves better. I don't let a person of color call me the N-word any more than I would let a person who was not a color call me that. I don't care what the argument is, the justification, I meant it like this. No, that's not what I am. You can look, I don't care that you mean that as a term of endearment, and we've become too comfortable in that space. That's just not who I am. And I would, Martha Stewart, or who the other lady, I forget the one who used the N-word. No, the cook. The cook. I forget her name. Yeah. Anyway, I wouldn't allow
Paula Deen.
Thank you. I wouldn't allow Paula Deen to call me the N-word. Why would I allow this African American black person on the street to call me the N-word? Why would I allow Drake to call me the N-word? Why would I allow Jay-Z to call me the N-word? To me, it's as disrespectful as Paula Deen, because what you're saying is that that's how you see me, and that's not who I am. Now, I tell people all the time, if you want to be that, hey, you can call yourself that.
Right.
You might be that, but that ain't what I am. And really, that's not what you are either. But, at least don't call me that. I'm going to work on trying to get you not to believe that about yourself. But at a minimum, you're not going to disrespect me in that way either. And that I would suggest is a huge, and I know that many people think that's not a huge issue. I think it is a tremendous issue, because it once again goes back to this psychosis of self-hatred. Yes. And that's really what we have, because America has taught us to hate people of color. And we've said, you know what? You're right. We will.
Yeah.
Definitely. Apostle, your thoughts on the spoken word?
Always, he hits it out of the park, and I think that it really sums up not only this show, but the mentality of Black America, just our plight and certain pains and frustrations that we have. He does an excellent job in summing that up. So
definitely,
I enjoyed it.
And once again, this is, I sent you three, we talked about, this conversation, and I sent you sort of three conversations potentially. I am equal parts political commentator, that sort of thing, person of faith, minister, man of God, and artist. And what I love about what he did was it engaged the arts
Yeah.
to tell a story and a message. And one thing that breaks my heart, as I begin to talk just briefly about some of our artists, is the way that our unbelievably beautiful artistic expression has been used to destroy our community. I was in South Korea a couple years ago. I was talking to a guy who was at a conference, international conference, and the guy was Palestinian. And we were sitting on a bus riding to some event or whatever, and we were talking, and he says to me, and he says, we don't allow in our culture, in our country, our kids to look at what your community puts out from America.
Wow.
And he goes, and he says to me, he says, why is it that your community is being used to poison really the rest of the world? And I said, that's very interesting. And he didn't say, why are you poisoning? He said, why is it being used to poison?
Yeah.
So he understood sort of the larger corporate kind of model, that sort of thing. And, I look at, many of our artists and entertainers, and I say, man, you're amazing.
He was speaking of the Black community?
Yes, he was speaking of hip hop culture, and I'm not talking about hip hop. I love hip hop, by the way. I listen to hip hop. I actually, in my artistic life, teach hip hop dance. So I love hip hop expression.
I'm not delivered from it.
Okay, so we can talk about that too, right? Sometimes I'm not down to hip hop. What I'm saying is that even in the book I write about how American culture has worked to be antithetical to biblical principles of morality, fidelity, that sort of thing. And African Americans have been exploited at the forefront, if you will, of sort of decimating the moral compass, if you will, of sort of the rest of the world, starting with ourselves. So when you look at our radio stations, for instance, I can't let my children listen to most Black music on the radio. Isn't that terrible? Think about it. Unless it's praise and worship music. Because now they can listen to, I hate to say this, but if you listen to, a sort of a pop station, they might still have some of the same messages, don't get it twisted, but it's much more coded.
Toned down. Yeah.
But in our community, we talking about, behinds and strippers and this and that, and we glorifying. It's like, and it's like, whoa, wait a second. This is not freedom. This is slavery.
Yeah. There's always an explicit version.
Absolutely. And so when I look at that, I say, I'm an artist at heart. So I dance, act, write, I've worked in theater, I've toured. I'm an artist at heart. But art has always historically been used to uplift, not tear down our people. And we have to hold these artists accountable. And I know these brothers and sisters are trying to get paid, and I understand it. And I know they're trying to express themselves. I understand that too. I get it. But can we take some responsibility for the messages that you are giving to kids? Come on, y'all. Is the money really that serious to you that you are willing to have 5-year-old girls imitating you doing things that adults only should do?
Yeah.
That's not cool.
Yeah. And sound is so subliminal. It speaks to your subconscious. And so they can even just be around it.
Right.
They can just be around it. And if it's playing in the background, it'll affect us.
It will. Gentlemen, can you believe we're at the end of a show?
No. No.
I can't believe it. See, that when you get into discussions that are of relevance and so important, it just flies by. But I want to thank you both again. Mr. Williams, thank you so much.
Man.
I appreciate you. And I'm sorry, please tell them real quick where they can get your book.
You can buy my book on my website. Don't buy it off Amazon. Buy it off my website. I mean, you have to buy it on Amazon, but I'll tell you how the business works. It's better to buy it from me than it is to buy on Amazon. I'll explain that one on the next entrepreneur conversation. TedWilliams3rd.com, TedWilliams3Is, III.com. And, connect with me. Connect with me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, whatever. I'm a people person. And I believe that we're all put on this earth to make a difference in someone else's life. And so, I just like to connect with people just because,
Great.
that to me is where I get the greatest fulfillment. So if something that we've talked about today sparks you, whatever, let's talk about it. Hit me up and let's communicate. Maybe you can help me do this work better in our community. We all need each other.
Love it. Love it. Well, I can't thank you enough. And Apostle, thank you so much for joining
My
and
pleasure. This was a
jumping in on the
pleasure.
conversation
This was a
today.
pleasure.
Appreciate you. And all of you listeners, watchers, for viewing, for your comments, joining Annette today. I appreciate you as well. We're going to kind of continue in this vein tomorrow evening, I think. Join us at 5 o'clock tomorrow evening, Intellectual Radio, Mind, Body, and Soul, A&D Conversation. But this is Mind, Body, and Soul with Annette, and I just want to thank each of you again. Join us on next week. We have more hot guests for the rest of December. Going to try and end this year with a bang. So I need you all to make sure you stay tuned, and I get some promos out so that you can view them and be ready to join us. So this has been a great conversation today. The agenda for uplifting Black America. And it has been more than I even thought it would be. Very, very well. Earl, thank you so much for this time here, Intellectual Radio. And if y'all are interested, contact Earl, the other Winfrey, interested in getting your own show here. He would be more than willing to accommodate you. So you've been listening to Mind, Body, and Soul with Annette, right here on Intellectual Radio. And until next time, I want you to get caught up with Annette.
You've just been listening to Mind, Body, and Soul with Annette, where host Annette Harris provided you with psychological and biblical insight for your everyday concerns. Need more insight? Visit Annette's Facebook page at Mind, Body, and Soul with Annette. Don't forget, tune in next week for Mind, Body, and Soul with Annette.